Chapter 13. The Trickster's Game. Dawn crept over Concordia with the reluctant pace of a city holding its breath. From his concealed position in the abandoned watchtower overlooking the portal hub, Cael prepared to witness what he assumed would be the final coordination of his city's systematic destruction. The portal hub's courtyards had been cleared of all non-essential personnel, leaving only the most senior administrators and their heaviest security details. Through his spyglass, Cael could see the tension in their movements. These were men preparing to brief someone whose displeasure could mean more than just career disappointment. At precisely dawn, a figure emerged from the hub's main entrance, flanked by guards who seemed more nervous than protective. Even at this distance, Cael could see why. The woman who stepped into the morning light carried herself with an authority that made seasoned military officers look like nervous children. Commander Ravina was smaller than he'd expected, appearing almost human in her proportions, but there was something in her bearing that suggested depths of power, carefully concealed. Her raven-black hair caught the early light, and even from his distant position, Cael could sense the way the very air seemed to shift around her presence. What struck him most was the reaction of everyone around her. These were men who'd spent months implementing brutal occupation policies without hesitation. Yet they approached Ravina with the careful deference of those who knew they were in the presence of something far more dangerous than conventional authority. The meeting itself was brief, lasting perhaps 20 minutes, but Cael could see the dynamics even without hearing the words. This wasn't a military briefing between equals. It was a predator receiving reports from prey, and everyone present understood their position in that hierarchy. When the meeting concluded, something unexpected happened. Instead of the increased urgency Cael had anticipated, the administrators dispersed with visible relief. Their body language suggested reprieve rather than escalation, as if they'd been given permission to step back from the precipice rather than being pushed over it. More telling was what didn't happen in the hours that followed. The systematic searches that had been proceeding with military efficiency simply slowed. Not stopped entirely, but conducted with less aggression, less urgency. As if those conducting them were suddenly uncertain about how far they should push. By midday, reports from his remaining contacts painted a picture that confused rather than clarified the situation. The occupation forces were still present, still maintaining control, but their behavior had shifted. Instead of the methodical brutality that had characterized the previous day, they seemed to be operating with unusual caution. "It's like they're afraid to do anything that might draw attention," reported a serving woman from the governor's residence, delivered through the usual coded channels. "The administrators keep asking each other what she would want, but no one seems to know." The evening brought even stranger news. Several resistance members who'd been captured in the morning sweeps were quietly released without explanation. Not all of them, perhaps a dozen out of the 40-odd who'd been taken, but enough to suggest a significant policy change. Most puzzling was the complete cessation of the cleanup operations expansion. The systematic elimination had simply stopped. Not completed, not officially cancelled, but suspended in a way that left everyone involved uncertain about what came next. As Cael sat in his corner of the broken shield that evening, processing intelligence that refused to form a coherent pattern, Mira approached with news that crystallized his confusion into something approaching understanding. "Word from the governor's residence," she said quietly, her usual cleaning motions more perfunctory than usual. The new commander held a private meeting with the senior staff, told them she found the heavy-handed approach to be tediously predictable. "Predictable," Cael repeated thoughtfully. "Apparently she's more interested in maintaining stability than demonstrating power. Said something about preferring elegant solutions to crude problems." Mira's expression suggested she found this as baffling as everyone else did. The pieces began falling into place for Cael. Commander Ravina hadn't arrived to escalate the systematic elimination. She'd arrived and found it boring. The methodical brutality that had characterized the cleanup operations was exactly the kind of predictable, heavy-handed approach that someone of her apparent sophistication would find beneath her interest. More importantly, her obvious authority over even the most senior occupation officials meant that her preferences became policy without question. If she found the systematic elimination tedious, it would be suspended regardless of its original importance. Over the following days, this assessment proved accurate. The cleanup operations didn't resume their previous intensity. Instead, the occupations settled into a new routine, one focused on maintaining control of the portal network and essential services, while largely ignoring the kind of small-scale resistance activities that Cael's network represented. The systematic searches continued sporadically, but without the methodical thoroughness that had made them so dangerous. It was as if the occupation forces had been told to maintain appearances without actually pushing hard enough to create the kind of chaos that might draw their new commander's attention. For Cael, this represented an unexpected opportunity. His network, which had been facing systematic destruction just days earlier, found itself operating in an environment of relative safety. Not complete safety, this was still an occupied city, but the existential threat had lifted. The servants, bartenders, and sex workers who formed the core of his intelligence network could return to their routines without the constant fear of being dragged away for questioning. The information flow resumed, though the intelligence it carried was different now, less about immediate survival, more about understanding the new dynamic that Ravina's presence had created. Most intriguingly, the intelligence suggested that Commander Ravina's authority extended far beyond Concordia. Communications intercepted by his contacts indicated that she was coordinating with forces throughout multiple realms, including direct contact with Draven himself. But these weren't the communications of subordinate to superior. From what his sources could determine, Draven, the powerful warlord who'd conquered Concordia, seemed to approach interactions with Ravina with the same nervous deference that characterized her local subordinates. "She has him under her thumb," observed one of his contacts who worked in the communications center. "He reports to her like a guilty child explaining why he broke something valuable." This revelation put everything into perspective for Cael. Commander Ravina wasn't just another high-ranking official in Black Dawn's hierarchy. She was someone whose authority was so absolute that it made even Draven himself nervous. Her preferences didn't need to be orders. They became reality through the simple expedient of everyone being too frightened to risk displeasing her. And apparently her preference was for subtlety over brutality, elegant control over crude demonstration. The systematic elimination had been suspended not because it was wrong, but because it bored her. As weeks passed, this new dynamic stabilized into something approaching normalcy. The occupation continued, but with a lighter touch. The portal network remained under strict control, but civilian life resumed much of its previous rhythm. Most importantly for Cael, his intelligence network not only survived but began to flourish again. The servants who'd risked everything to help him assassinate Lady Valerian found their positions secure, their contributions forgotten by authorities, more concerned with avoiding Ravina's attention than investigating past security breaches. The systematic investigation into resistance activities simply faded away, replaced by the kind of routine security measures that career survivors could navigate without difficulty. 3 months after Lady Valerian's death, Cael found himself in the unexpected position of running an intelligence network in a city where the primary threat came not from active persecution, but from complacency. The occupation had become predictable again, which made it easier to monitor but also less urgent to resist. It was, he reflected, exactly the kind of long-term equilibrium that would allow him to maintain his operations for years, if necessary. Commander Ravina's preference for elegant control had inadvertently created the perfect environment for his style of intelligence work, dangerous enough to matter, stable enough to sustain. As he sat in his corner of the broken shield, Watching the familiar rhythms of a tavern that had somehow survived everything the occupation could throw at it, Cael began planning for the long term. His network was intact, his methods were proven, and his enemy had inadvertently created conditions favourable to exactly the kind of patient, persistent observation that he did best. Commander Cael Varnor had entered the Shadow War expecting it to end in dramatic victory or crushing defeat. Instead, it had settled into the kind of quiet persistence that career intelligence officers understood better than anyone. The slow accumulation of knowledge, the patient cultivation of sources, the steady preparation for opportunities that might not come for years. Ravina's arrival had changed everything by changing nothing at all. The game continued, but now it was being played by rules that actually favoured the shadows where he lived. For the first time since Lady Valerian's trap had nearly destroyed him, Cael allowed himself to believe that he might actually survive long enough to put his accumulated intelligence to good use. The question was no longer whether his network could survive Concordia's occupation. The question was what he would do with it when the time finally came to act. Chapter 14. The Servant's Terror. Marta had worked in great houses for 30 years, and in all that time she'd learned the cardinal rule of survival. See nothing, hear nothing, speak of nothing that didn't concern the laundry. It was a philosophy that had kept her employed through 3 different masters, 2 wars, and now an occupation that had claimed the lives of servants less careful than herself. Tonight that philosophy would be put to its ultimate test. She approached Commander Ravina's quarters at precisely 11 p.m, as instructed. The evening tea service was a new addition to her duties, something the commander had specifically requested, claiming that the local water helped her sleep in unfamiliar surroundings. Marta had prepared the tray with particular care, the finest porcelain, the most delicate pastries, tea steeped to exactly the strength that administrative personnel seemed to prefer. The corridor outside the commander's suite was empty, as expected. The guards maintained their posts at the stairwell and main entrances, but Ravina had made it clear that she valued privacy over constant protection. "I'm more dangerous than anything likely to threaten me in this provincial city," she'd told the security chief, with the kind of casual confidence that made veteran soldiers nervous. Marta knocked gently on the heavy wooden door, 3 soft taps, then a pause, then 2 more, the pattern that identified evening service rather than urgent communication. "Enter," came the voice from within, though something in its tone made Marta hesitate. The word was spoken correctly, but there was an underlying quality to it that seemed different, deeper perhaps, more resonant than the crisp administrative tones she'd heard the commander use during official business. But hesitation was a luxury servants couldn't afford. Marta turned the handle and stepped into the suite's main chamber, her eyes focused respectfully on the floor, as she'd been trained to do when entering any superior's private space. "Your evening tea, Commander," she announced quietly, setting the tray down on the side table designated for such purposes. "Will there be anything else you require before—" The words died in her throat. She'd made the mistake of glancing up, just for a moment, to gauge whether the commander was listening or if she should simply withdraw quietly. What she saw drove every rational thought from her mind. The woman standing by the window was recognizably Commander Ravina. The same raven-black hair, the same athletic build, the same pale skin that marked her as someone from the Northern Territories. But everything else was wrong, impossibly and terrifyingly wrong. Massive wings spread from her shoulders, their spans so wide they nearly touched the walls on either side of the spacious chamber. The wings were midnight black, but they seemed to absorb light rather than simply blocking it, creating patches of darkness that hurt to look at directly. They moved slightly as Marta watched, not with the mechanical flutter of bird wings, but with something more organic, more alive. Worse were the eyes. Commander Ravina's violet eyes, which had seemed merely intense during official interactions, now glowed with an inner light that was distinctly, unmistakably inhuman. Ice-blue radiance emanated from them, casting shadows in directions that defied the room's actual lighting. But it was the expression on her face that truly terrified Marta. Not anger or surprise at being discovered, but a kind of lazy contentment, like a predator that had finally stopped pretending to be prey. This was Commander Ravina relaxed, unguarded, allowing her true nature to show in what she believed was complete privacy. For a moment that stretched into eternity, neither woman moved. Ravina stood by the window, her wings spread in casual comfort, her glowing eyes fixed on something beyond the glass. She seemed utterly unaware that she was no longer alone, lost in whatever thoughts occupied the mind of something that was definitely not human. Marta felt her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she was certain the sound would give her away. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to scream, to do something other than stand frozen in the presence of whatever nightmare had taken the form of a military administrator. But 30 years of service had trained those instincts into submission. Instead of fleeing, Marta did what terrified servants had been doing since the first great house was built. She became invisible. Moving with the careful silence that was second nature to someone who'd cleaned around sleeping nobles for decades, Marta stepped backward toward the door. Her eyes never left the figure by the window, waiting for any sign that her presence had been detected. Ravina stretched slightly, her wings flexing with a sound like leather settling, and for a heart-stopping moment, Marta was certain she'd been noticed. But the commander's attention remained focused on whatever lay beyond the window. Perhaps the city lights, perhaps something only supernatural senses could perceive. Marta's hand found the door handle behind her. She turned it with infinite care, knowing that even the smallest sound might draw attention she couldn't survive. The mechanism clicked so softly it was barely audible even to her own ears. She slipped through the gap without opening the door fully, pulling it closed behind her with the same exquisite care. Only when the latch engaged with its whisper-quiet click did she allow herself to breathe again. Then she ran. Not the panicked flight of someone being pursued, but the swift, purposeful movement of a servant with urgent business elsewhere. She moved through the residence's service corridors like a ghost, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the worn stone floors. It wasn't until she reached the servants' quarters in the basement that the full impact of what she'd witnessed crashed over her. Marta collapsed onto her narrow bed, her entire body shaking with terror she couldn't control. What was that thing? The question hammered at her consciousness, demanding answers she didn't possess. Commander Ravina was supposed to be human, a military officer, an administrator, someone who used conventional authority to command conventional soldiers. But humans didn't have wings. Humans' eyes didn't glow with inner fire. Humans didn't radiate the kind of otherworldly presence that made every primitive instinct scream warnings about predators and unnatural things. Marta had grown up in the countryside, where old women still told stories about creatures that walked in human form but were something else entirely underneath. Shapeshifters, demons, things that borrowed human appearance while serving darker purposes. She'd always assumed such stories were merely tales to frighten children into good behavior. Now, huddled on her bed, while her hands refused to stop shaking, she understood that some stories were warnings dressed as entertainment. The worst part was the knowledge that she couldn't tell anyone. Who would believe such an account? More importantly, who could she trust with information that would certainly mean her death if it reached the wrong ears? Commander Ravina's reaction to being exposed as something inhuman would be swift and final. But even if Marta said nothing, keeping such knowledge to herself felt like carrying poison in her soul. As the night wore on and her terror gradually subsided into manageable fear, one thought kept returning. Someone needs to know. Not the occupation authorities. They were either already aware of their commander's true nature or would eliminate anyone who suggested such impossibilities. Not the other servants. They had their own survival to consider. But there were others in the city. People who worked in shadows, who gathered information about things the occupation preferred to keep hidden. People who might understand what such knowledge meant and how to use it safely. By dawn, Marta had made her decision. The risk of speaking was enormous, but the risk of remaining silent might be even greater. If Commander Ravina was something other than human, then everyone in Concordia was living under a threat they didn't understand. Someone had to be warned. Even if it cost Marta her life, someone had to know that the woman commanding their city's occupation was a creature with wings of shadow and eyes that burned with inhuman light. The question was finding someone trustworthy enough to tell and brave enough to act on such impossible information. As she prepared for another day of invisible service, Marta began listening more carefully to the whispered conversations in the servants' quarters. There were rumors of people who helped those in need, who protected the vulnerable from the occupation's worst excesses. Perhaps it was time to discover if such rumors were true. 3 days later, the message reached Cael through a chain of contacts so nervous that each handler passed it along with visible relief. The final messenger was Petra, an elderly woman who cleaned government buildings and had connections throughout the servant networks. "There's a woman needs to speak with you," Petra said, her voice shaking despite the familiar surroundings of the Broken Shield's back room. "Says she's seen something that can't be real, but she swears it happened." Cael looked up from the coded reports he'd been reviewing. "What kind of something?" "The kind that might get us all killed for knowing about it." Petra's weathered hands twisted in her apron. "She works in the governor's residence. Says she saw Commander Ravina, differently than she appears during the day." "Differently how?" Petra swallowed hard. "Wings," she says. "Black wings like a demon's, and eyes that glowed like cold fire. Says the commander was alone in her chambers, looking like something that just pretended to be human during business hours." The room went very quiet. Outside, the tavern's normal evening sounds continued. Conversations, laughter, the clink of glasses. But inside the back room, silence stretched between them, like a physical presence. "You believe her?" Cael asked finally. "I believe she's terrified enough to risk everything telling someone about it," Petra replied. "That's not the kind of story someone makes up for attention." Cael thought about Commander Ravina's effect on the occupation forces, the way even hardened military officers approached her with nervous deference. He'd assumed it was simple fear of authority, but what if it was something more primal? "Arrange a meeting," he said quietly. "Somewhere private, somewhere safe. If she's willing to risk telling this story, I need to hear it directly." Petra nodded, though her expressions suggested she thought they were all walking toward disaster. "Tomorrow night, then. The old chapel in the Artisans' Quarter. She'll be there at midnight." As Petra left to make the arrangements, Cael remained in the back room, processing implications that threatened to rewrite everything he thought he understood about Concordia's occupation. If Commander Ravina wasn't human, then the research program might have purposes beyond conventional military enhancement. If she was some kind of supernatural being disguising herself as a human administrator, then the power dynamics he'd been observing were far more complex than they appeared. Most disturbing was the possibility that he'd been gathering intelligence about an enemy whose true nature he'd completely misunderstood. All his careful observations, all his tactical assessments might be worthless when applied to something that operated by entirely different rules. The Shadow War was about to become something far stranger and more dangerous than Commander Cael Varnor had ever imagined. Chapter 15. The Witness. The old chapel in the Artisans' Quarter had been abandoned since before the occupation began, its congregations scattered by economic hardship rather than military force. But its thick stone walls and multiple entrances made it ideal for meetings that required both privacy and quick escape routes. Cael arrived early, as was his habit, positioning himself where he could observe both the main entrance and the side door, while remaining concealed behind a fallen section of roof timber. The autumn night was cold enough that his breath misted in the air, but not so cold as to be uncomfortable for someone accustomed to long periods of motionless observation. At 5 minutes past midnight, the side door opened to admit two figures, an elderly woman he recognized as Petra, and a younger woman whose nervous movements marked her as someone venturing far outside her normal experience. Marta was perhaps 40, with the weathered hands and careful posture of someone who'd spent decades in domestic service. Her clothes were clean but well worn, the kind of practical garments that allowed for quick, quiet movement through great houses. Most tellingly, her eyes moved constantly, checking shadows and corners with the hypervigilance of someone who'd recently experienced genuine terror. "This is her," Petra said quietly, her voice echoing strangely in the empty chapel. "Marta, this is the man I told you about. He'll listen to your story." Cael stepped from the shadows, moving slowly to avoid startling someone who was clearly already on edge. "Thank you for coming," he said, keeping his voice gentle. "I understand you have information about Commander Ravina." Marta nodded, then immediately shook her head. "I don't know if it's information or madness. What I saw." She wrapped her arms around herself, as if trying to hold in words that wanted to escape. "It can't be real, but I saw it. I was there." "Tell me exactly what happened," Cael said, settling onto a broken pew in a position that allowed him to watch the entrances while giving Marta his full attention. "Start from the beginning. Include every detail you remember." The story came out in fits and starts, interrupted by moments when Marta seemed to doubt her own memories, but the core details remained consistent. Entering Ravina's chamber with the evening tea service, seeing the commander with massive black wings and glowing eyes, managing to escape undetected. "The wings weren't like bird wings," Marta said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "They moved wrong, like they were alive in a way that shouldn't be possible. And her eyes. I've never seen anything burn with cold light before. It was like looking at winter given form." Cael listened without interruption, cataloguing details while assessing Marta's credibility. Her terror was genuine. No one could fake the kind of deep-seated fear that made her hands shake when she described Ravina's appearance. But terror could spring from misunderstanding as easily as from supernatural encounter. "You're certain she didn't know you were there?" he asked when she finished. "Certain. She was looking out the window, completely relaxed, like she'd finally stopped pretending to be something she wasn't." Marta's eyes met his directly for the first time. "That's what frightened me most. Not that she looked like a demon, but that she looked comfortable, like this was her real form, and everything else was just acting." The detail rang true to Cael's observations of Ravina's effect on others. The way hardened soldiers approached her with instinctive wariness, the way conversations stopped when she entered rooms, the way even Draven himself seemed nervous in communications with her. "Has anyone else seen her this way?" he asked. "Not that I know of. She's very careful about privacy, and most of the evening staff work different sections of the residence." Marta hesitated. "But there have been comments. Other servants mentioning how the air feels different when she's around, how animals react strangely to her presence." Circumstantial evidence, but the kind that might support rather than contradict Marta's extraordinary claim. Still, Cael's military training demanded verification beyond a single witness account, no matter how credible. "I believe you saw what you described," he said carefully. "But for information this significant, I need more than one person's testimony. Would you be willing to help gather additional evidence?" Marta went pale. "You want me to spy on her again?" "Not spy, just confirm. If Commander Ravina regularly drops her human disguise in private, there should be ways to document that without putting you at risk." "Document how?" Petra asked, her voice sharp with concern for her contact. Cael had been considering possibilities while listening to Marta's account. "Small things. Times when she's alone in her chambers for extended periods. Whether the evening tea service happens consistently. Physical evidence that might support supernatural rather than human behavior. What kind of physical evidence? Marta asked, though her tone suggested she wasn't sure she wanted to know. Wing impressions on furniture or carpets, scorch marks from those glowing eyes, changes in temperature or air pressure that might indicate transformation. Cael kept his voice matter-of-fact, as if discussing routine intelligence gathering rather than proof of supernatural presence. Nothing that would require direct observation or personal risk. Marta was quiet for a long moment, wrestling with fear and conscience. If I help you, and she discovers what we're doing. She won't discover it from my end, Cael promised. And if the evidence confirms what you've seen, then people need to know. The occupation is dangerous enough when we understand what we're facing. If we're dealing with something that isn't human, that changes everything. Changes how? Petra asked. Tactics, expectations, understanding of what's really happening in Concordia. Cael turned back to Marta. You said she looked comfortable in that form, like it was her real self. That suggests she's not just using supernatural abilities, she is something supernatural, disguised as human for her own purposes. The implications hung in the chapel's cold air like incense smoke. If Commander Ravina was some kind of shapeshifter or demon, then the occupation's true purpose might be far different from simple military control. The research program, the portal network, even the systematic elimination might serve goals that had nothing to do with conventional conquest. I'll help, Marta said finally, her voice barely audible. But I won't go back into her chambers. I can't. You won't need to, Cael assured her. Just maintain your normal duties and watch for opportunities. If she requests privacy for extended periods, note the timing. If you notice unusual sounds or effects from her quarters, remember the details. If other servants mention strange experiences, listen carefully. And if I find evidence, report it through the same channels that brought you here tonight. But be careful. If we're right about what she is, then she's far more dangerous than any human commander. As the meeting concluded and the two women prepared to leave, Marta turned back to Cael with a question that had clearly been troubling her. If she's not human, then what is she? And why is she here pretending to be one of them? Those, Cael replied grimly, are exactly the questions we need to answer. The women departed through the side door, their footsteps fading into the night. Cael remained seated on the broken pew, processing the potential ramifications of Marta's testimony while maintaining his vigilant watch of the chapel's entrances. An hour passed in contemplative silence. The autumn wind whistled through gaps in the damaged roof, creating sounds that might mask approaching footsteps. But Cael's trained senses detected nothing beyond the normal night sounds of an abandoned building settling into deeper cold. He was preparing to leave when the main entrance opened with deliberate slowness. The figure that entered moved with fluid grace, stepping through the doorway as if she owned not just the building but the very air within it. Even in the chapel's dim light, Cael recognized her immediately, the raven-black hair, the lithe build, the commanding presence that made hardened soldiers nervous. Commander Ravina had come calling. She closed the door behind her with the same deliberate care, the sound echoing through the empty space like a challenge. Then she turned toward where Cael sat, concealed behind the fallen timber, her violet eyes finding him in the shadows as if darkness posed no obstacle to her vision. You can come out now, she said, her voice carrying the same crisp authority he'd heard her use with subordinates. But underneath the familiar tones was something else. Amusement, perhaps. Or anticipation. I know exactly where you are. Cael remained motionless, weighing options. His concealment was good enough to fool human observers, but if Ravina possessed supernatural senses, hiding was pointless. The question was whether revealing himself would lead to capture, elimination, or something else entirely. I'm not here to arrest you, Ravina continued, moving further into the chapel with the confidence of someone who feared no ambush. Though I admit, your network is impressive. It took considerable effort to trace the information flow back to its source. The admission sent ice through Cael's veins. If she'd mapped his network, then everyone who'd helped him, Petra, Marta, dozens of others, was in mortal danger. "Oh, don't look so stricken," Ravina said, somehow sensing his reaction despite the darkness. "Your people are perfectly safe. I have no interest in punishing them for playing their parts in what's become quite an entertaining game." Game. The word carried implications that made Cael's tactical mind race through possibilities, none of them comforting. Slowly, carefully, he rose from his concealment and stepped into the chapel's central aisle. At this distance, he could see Ravina more clearly, the pale skin, the violet eyes that seemed to hold depths of knowledge he couldn't fathom, the slight smile that suggested she was enjoying herself immensely. "Commander," he said, keeping his voice neutral despite the circumstances, "please, call me Ravina. We're past the need for formal titles, don't you think?" She moved to one of the intact pews and settled onto it with casual elegance. "After all, you've been watching me for months, learning my habits, analysing my methods, building quite the detailed profile of my operations." "It's nothing personal," Cael replied carefully. "Just information gathering." "Oh, but it is personal. That's what makes it so interesting." Ravina's smile widened, revealing perfect teeth that caught what little light filtered through the damaged windows. "You see, I've been equally fascinated by your work, the precision of your intelligence network, the elegance of your operational security, the careful balance between passive observation and active intervention." She gestured toward the space around them. "This meeting, for instance. Perfect location choice, excellent security protocols, flawless execution of a high-risk contact. Very impressive." Cael's mind worked frantically to understand the dynamic developing between them. Ravina wasn't behaving like a military commander who'd discovered a security threat. She was acting like someone who'd found an intellectual equal worthy of her attention. "The servant who saw you," he said, testing the waters. "Marta, was that staged?" "Partly," Ravina admitted with the air of someone enjoying a good chess match. "I did allow my true form to emerge. Maintaining human appearance constantly is exhausting, and I occasionally need to stretch. But I was aware of her presence. I wanted to see how long it would take for that information to reach you and how you'd respond to it." "And the terror?" Her fear was genuine. "Oh, absolutely. Poor thing nearly fainted when she saw my wings." Ravina's expression showed mild regret. "I don't enjoy frightening innocent people, but fear makes for very convincing testimony. You needed to believe the information was legitimate, which meant she needed to genuinely experience what she described." The casual manipulation was breathtaking in its scope. Ravina had orchestrated Marta's terror, the information network's response, and this entire meeting as part of some larger game whose rules Cael didn't understand. "Why?" he asked simply. "Because I was bored," Ravina replied with startling honesty. "Do you have any idea how tedious military occupation becomes when you're not actually interested in conquest? All those reports, all those protocols, all those earnest administrators explaining why their particular approach to systematic oppression is superior to their colleagues." She leaned forward slightly, her violet eyes holding his with uncomfortable intensity. "But you've been playing a completely different game. Not trying to overthrow the occupation through force or political maneuvering, but building something subtle and patient and beautifully complex. I wanted to meet the mind behind such elegant work." "And now you have," Cael said, still trying to understand what she wanted from this encounter. "Indeed. And I find myself curious about your next move." Ravina settled back against the pew, completely relaxed, despite being alone with someone who'd spent months gathering intelligence about her operations. "You know what I am now, or at least, you know I'm not entirely human. The question is, what you intend to do with that knowledge." The question hung between them like a blade. Cael understood that his answer would determine not just his own fate, but potentially the fate of everyone in his network. Whatever game Ravina was playing, this moment was crucial to its outcome. "That depends," he said carefully, "on what you want from me." Ravina's smile became genuinely pleased, like a teacher whose student had asked exactly the right question. "Now that," she said, "is what I hoped you'd say." The abandoned chapel fell silent except for the wind through broken stones, two players in a game whose stakes and rules were only beginning to become clear. Ravina studied Cael for a long moment, her violet eyes seeming to catalogue every detail of his appearance and demeanour. When she spoke again, her voice carried a note of genuine frustration beneath its cultured tones. "Do you know what it's like," she said, "to be surrounded by people who are terrified to think in your presence? Every conversation is, 'Yes, Commander, and of course, Commander, and whatever you command, Commander.' If I so much as clear my throat, grown men start sweating through their uniforms." She stood and began pacing the chapel's narrow aisle, her movements carrying a restless energy that hadn't been visible during her official appearances. "I've been in Concordia for 3 months," she continued, "and in that time, exactly 0 people have surprised me. 0. Do you understand how mind-numbingly tedious that becomes? I'm not even human, and I'm dying of boredom dealing with humans who've forgotten how to be interesting." Cael watched her pace, noting how her frustration made her seem more alive, more present than the controlled figure he'd observed from a distance. "And yet you stay." "Oh, I have my reasons for being here, but they don't require me to be mentally vegetative while I accomplish them." She turned to face him, and something in her expression had shifted. The command authority was still there, but beneath it was something else. Appreciation, perhaps, or interest. "You, however," she said, her voice taking on a different quality entirely, "have been absolutely fascinating to watch. Do you realize you've managed something that seasoned intelligence officers with decades of experience couldn't accomplish? You've built an information network that I, with supernatural senses and unlimited authority, had to work to penetrate." There was admiration in her tone now, unmistakable and unexpected. Cael felt the conversation shifting into territory his military training hadn't prepared him for. "More than that," Ravina continued, moving closer, "you've done it with elegance. No crude threats, no dramatic gestures, no obvious power plays. Just patient, intelligent work that created something genuinely impressive." She paused directly in front of him. "When was the last time anyone impressed you, Commander Varnor?" The use of his real name and rank was clearly calculated to demonstrate the extent of her knowledge, but Cael found himself more intrigued by the question itself. "It's been some time," he admitted. "Exactly." Ravina's smile became something warmer than mere amusement. Intelligence recognizes intelligence, doesn't it? Even across the lines of conflict. She was standing close enough now that he could see the subtle patterns in her violet eyes, could detect the faint scent of something that wasn't quite human but wasn't unpleasant. Everything about her radiated controlled power, but also something else. A genuine appreciation that seemed as unexpected to her as it was to him. "You intrigue me, Cael," she said, using his given name with casual intimacy. "In a city full of people who bore me to tears, you've managed to create genuine mystery, genuine challenge. That's rare. Rarer than you might imagine." The way she spoke his name, the way her eyes held his, the subtle shift in her posture. Cael realized with surprise that Commander Ravina was flirting with him, not as part of some manipulation, but with what seemed like genuine interest. "I have a proposal for you," she said, settling back onto the pew but maintaining eye contact. "A game, if you will. Something to make both our situations more stimulating." "What kind of game?" Cael asked, though he suspected he wasn't going to like the answer. "The kind where the stakes make it interesting," Ravina replied, her smile becoming sharp-edged again. "Here are the terms. I present you with a challenge. something requiring all that impressive intelligence and network you've built. If you succeed, I leave Concordia within the month and take all knowledge of your operations with me. Your secrets remain yours, your people remain safe, and you return to whatever shadows you prefer. And if I fail? If you fail, or if you refuse to play, then I'm afraid I'll have to take a much more direct interest in your activities. Her tone remained conversational, but something in her eyes suggested the consequences would be severe. I can't allow potential threats to operate without oversight, no matter how much I might personally admire their craftsmanship. Cael considered the proposal, weighing risks against potential outcomes. What's the challenge? Now that would spoil the fun, wouldn't it? Ravina stood again, moving toward the chapel's main entrance. You have 3 days to decide whether you want to play. If you're interested, leave a white flower on the altar here. If not, she shrugged. Well, let's hope you're interested. She paused at the door, looking back over her shoulder. Oh, and Cael? Don't make the mistake of thinking you can simply disappear or evacuate your network. I know where everyone is, and I'm quite capable of tracking people across realms if necessary. The only way out of this situation is through it. Why? Cael asked. Why create this game? Why not simply eliminate the threat I represent? Ravina's expression softened slightly, revealing something that might have been genuine loneliness beneath the supernatural confidence. Because, she said quietly, for the first time in longer than you can imagine, I've found someone worth playing with. It would be such a waste to simply destroy that. With that, she slipped through the door and disappeared into the night, leaving Cael alone in the abandoned chapel with the scent of her presence and the weight of an impossible choice. As he sat in the silence that followed, Cael understood that everything had changed. The shadow war he'd been fighting was over, replaced by something far more personal and infinitely more dangerous. Commander Ravina, whatever she truly was, had just made him an offer he couldn't refuse and couldn't accept. The question was whether his intelligence and network would prove sufficient for whatever challenge she had in mind, or whether he was about to become the latest casualty in a game whose rules were written by something that wasn't entirely human. The white flower on the altar would be his answer. But as he made his way home through Concordia's dark streets, Cael was already certain what that answer would have to be. Some games were too dangerous to play, others were too dangerous to refuse. The question was which category this one fell into. Chapter 16. The White Lily. The morning after his encounter with Ravina, Cael woke with absolute clarity about his situation. The game had not begun when she made her proposal in the chapel. It had begun the moment she'd walked through those doors. Every decision he'd made since, every breath he'd taken had been part of her evaluation. She was watching. Always watching. Testing his reactions, his choices, his ability to function under the weight of supernatural scrutiny. Well, if she wanted to see how he handled pressure, he would show her. Cael dressed with his usual care, maintaining the routines that had kept him alive for over 2 years of shadow operations. But as he prepared for the day, his mind was working through implications and opportunities with the focused precision of a chess master who'd finally found a worthy opponent. The white flower was obviously meant to be his response to her challenge, but the timing and choice of flower would send messages as important as the acceptance itself. She expected him to spend 3 days agonizing over the decision, revealing his thought processes and concerns through his behavior. Instead, he would give her an answer that demonstrated he understood the game better than she'd anticipated. The flower market in the central district opened at dawn, its vendors arranging their wares with the practiced efficiency of people who'd learned to make beauty from whatever the current crisis would allow. Cael moved through the stalls with apparent casualness, just another citizen making an early purchase before the day's work began. But his destination was specific: Helena's flower stall, tucked between a spice merchant and a baker, in a location that offered clear sightlines in all directions. Helena was a widow in her 50s who'd been providing flowers for Concordia's ceremonies and celebrations since before the occupation. More importantly, she was one of the few vendors who still carried the more exotic varieties that held deeper symbolic meanings. "Something special today?" Helena asked as Cael approached her display. Her weathered hands continued arranging stems while her eyes catalogued his appearance with the sharp assessment of someone who'd learned to read customers' needs quickly. "A white lily," Cael said simply. "The finest you have." Helena's hands paused briefly in their work, her eyes meeting his with sudden interest. "White lilies are serious flowers," she said carefully. "They carry weight, meaning, not something you choose lightly." "No," Cael agreed. "They're not." She studied him for a moment longer, then reached beneath her counter to retrieve a single white lily of extraordinary beauty. The flower was perfect, each petal flawless, the stem strong and straight, the overall effect both elegant and somehow solemn. "This one came in yesterday," Helena said, handling it with reverence. "Grown in the monastery gardens outside the city. The monks say flowers grown in holy ground carry special significance." "Perfect," Cael said, placing coins on her counter. "Thank you." As he prepared to leave, Helena caught his arm gently. "Be careful with that one," she said quietly. "White lilies, they're powerful symbols. They can mean rebirth, but they can also mean endings, sometimes both at the same time." "I understand," Cael replied. "That's exactly what makes them appropriate." The chapel looked different in daylight, more ruin than sanctuary, but the altar remained intact, its stone surface worn smooth by centuries of use and weathered by decades of abandonment. Cael approached it with the same careful reverence he might have shown in an active place of worship. The white lily seemed to glow against the dark stone as he placed it precisely in the altar's centre. The positioning was deliberate, not casually tossed down, but arranged with the respect due to both the symbol and the recipient of its message. As he stepped back, Cael reflected on what the flower would tell Ravina about his state of mind. The immediate placement showed he wasn't intimidated by her challenge or cowed by her supernatural nature. The choice of lily demonstrated sophistication beyond mere tactical thinking. The flower's associations with both death and rebirth suggested he understood the stakes while remaining prepared for transformation. Most importantly, it showed he was ready to play her game on terms that went beyond simple military strategy. If she wanted intellectual and psychological challenge, he would provide it. But as he turned to leave the chapel, Cael realized he wasn't alone. Ravina stood in the doorway, backlit by morning sun that seemed to bend around her form in ways that ordinary light shouldn't. She wore the same human appearance he'd observed during official functions, but now he could see the subtle signs that marked her as something else, the way shadows fell differently around her, the way the air itself seemed to respond to her presence. "A white lily," she said, her voice carrying approval mixed with something that might have been surprise. "Not what I expected." "What did you expect?" Cael asked, maintaining his position near the altar. "A white rose, perhaps. Something that spoke to secrecy and intelligence work." She moved into the chapel with that same fluid grace, her attention focused on the flower he'd placed. "But a lily? That's much more interesting." She stopped beside the altar, her fingers hovering over the white petals without quite touching them. Death and rebirth. Transition. Purity of purpose. Her violet eyes lifted to meet his. "You understand that this game could end with one of us not surviving it?" "I understand the stakes," Cael replied evenly. "The question is whether you do." That earned him a smile, genuine pleasure rather than mere amusement. "Oh, I think I'm beginning to. Tell me, Commander, what made you choose this particular response? Why not take the full 3 days to consider?" "Because the game started the moment you walked into this chapel last night," Cael said, finally giving voice to his realization. Every choice I've made since then has been part of your evaluation. Waiting 3 days would only have shown you that I was slow to understand the rules. Ravina's smile widened, revealing that expression of delighted recognition he'd glimpsed before. Excellent. I was hoping you'd figure that out quickly. So, what's the actual challenge? Cael asked. Now that we've established I'm willing to play and intelligent enough to understand when the game began. The challenge, Ravina said, moving closer with predatory grace, is to discover my real purpose in Concordia. Not the official reasons, not the research program, not the portal network maintenance. My actual personal objective for being here. She paused directly in front of him, close enough that he could see the otherworldly depths in her violet eyes. You have 2 weeks to uncover what I'm really doing in this city. If you succeed, I leave and take all knowledge of your operations with me. If you fail... You already explained the consequences, Cael said. Did I? Ravina tilted her head slightly. I mentioned taking a more direct interest in your activities, but I didn't specify what that interest might entail. The implication hung between them, loaded with possibilities both threatening and intriguing. Cael understood that he was walking into territory his military training hadn't prepared him for, a game where the rules included elements that had nothing to do with conventional conflict. 2 weeks, he said, confirming the timeline. 2 weeks, starting now. Ravina stepped back, but her eyes remained fixed on his. Oh, and Cael? Don't assume that conventional intelligence methods will be sufficient. What I'm really doing here, it requires understanding motivations that go beyond human logic. With that cryptic warning, she turned and walked toward the chapel's entrance. But she paused at the threshold, looking back over her shoulder. The lily was perfect, by the way. It shows you understand that some games are worth playing even when they might destroy you. Her expression softened slightly. I'm looking forward to seeing what else you understand. Then she was gone, leaving Cael alone with the white lily and the weight of a challenge that would test every skill he'd developed over decades of intelligence work. 2 weeks to discover the real purpose of a supernatural being who'd spent months orchestrating events for her own amusement. 2 weeks to penetrate motivations that went beyond human understanding. 2 weeks to prove that his intelligence and network were sufficient for challenges that transcended conventional warfare. As he made his way back through Concordia's awakening streets, Cael began planning his approach to the most complex intelligence operation of his career. He would need every contact, every skill, every hard-won insight he'd accumulated. But he would not, could not, reveal his connection to the House of Night Whispers. That remained his ace in the hole, to be played only if all other options failed. The White Lily had accepted her challenge. Now he had to prove worthy of the game she'd created around him. Commander Cael Varnor had faced impossible missions before, but he'd never faced an opponent who might not be bound by any logic he understood. The real test was just beginning. Chapter 17. Old War Stories. The evening crowd at the Broken Shield was heavier than usual, filled with Black Dawn soldiers whose duties had kept them working through the day's unseasonable heat. They clustered around tables in small groups, their conversations a mix of complaints about officers, speculation about deployments, and the kind of dark humour that helped military personnel cope with uncertainty. Cael had positioned himself at the bar rather than his usual corner table, nursing a whiskey while scanning the room with practiced casualness. He was looking for specific types: soldiers who showed signs of recent travel, veterans with enough experience to have served in multiple realms, anyone whose conversation might reveal useful intelligence about Commander Ravina's activities beyond Concordia. His target presented himself within 20 minutes, a sergeant in his 40s whose uniform bore the subtle signs of cross-realm deployment. The man's boots showed dust patterns consistent with volcanic soil. His sleeve bore a small repair that used thread not available in Concordia. And most tellingly, He carried himself with the slight disorientation of someone still adjusting to local gravity and atmospheric pressure. The sergeant approached the bar alone, ordering ale with the economical movements of someone conserving energy after a long day. Perfect. Rough deployment? Cael asked conversationally, gesturing toward the man's dusty boots while signalling the bartender for another round. The sergeant glanced at him with the automatic wariness soldiers develop towards civilians, but the offer of a free drink and Cael's weathered appearance suggested someone who might understand military life. Could be worse, the sergeant replied, accepting the ale with a nod of thanks. Though I'll admit, it's good to be back in a realm where the air doesn't try to burn your lungs. Volcanic realm? Cael asked, taking a sip of his own drink. Did some time in the Ashlands myself, years back. Border patrol during the territorial disputes. The lie came easily, supported by enough genuine military knowledge to pass casual scrutiny. The sergeant's posture relaxed slightly at the recognition of shared experience. Not the Ashlands, but close enough. Mirkdusk operations. The sergeant took a long pull of his ale. Hot, dry, everything covered in fine dust that gets into your gear no matter what you do. Mirkdusk, Cael repeated thoughtfully. Heard that's where the real research happens. Above my clearance level, but soldiers talk. They do indeed. The sergeant's expression grew more guarded, but not enough to end the conversation. Though most of what they say is speculation and rumour. Cael signalled for another round, letting the sergeant see him paying with coins that suggested modest but steady income, someone worth maintaining a conversation with. Always is with the classified operations, but you get pieces, bits of information that make you wonder. He raised his glass in a casual toast. To wondering what the hell our superiors are really up to. The sergeant chuckled and returned the toast. Amen to that. Though between you and me, some of the things I've seen in Mirkdusk, they make Concordia look like a vacation posting. How so? The sergeant glanced around the tavern, ensuring their conversation wasn't being overheard by anyone in uniform. The research facilities there are extensive. Multiple levels, specialized laboratories, equipment I couldn't begin to identify. And the test subjects, he shook his head. Let's just say they're not all volunteers. Cael kept his expression neutral while filing away this information. Sounds like serious work. Must take serious people to oversee something like that. Oh, it does. Commander Ravina herself spends most of her time there, coordinating with the research teams. The sergeant's voice dropped further. Though lately she's been different. More focused, maybe. Like she's looking for something specific. Different how? The sergeant hesitated, clearly weighing how much to reveal to a civilian. But the alcohol and the relief of having someone to talk to loosened his tongue. She's always been intimidating. Everyone knows that. But recently, it's like she's barely containing something. The other officers walk on eggshells around her, and even the research staff seem nervous when she's conducting inspections. Maybe the pressure of running such a complex operation, Cael suggested, prompting for more details. Maybe. Or maybe it's whatever she's been searching for in the archives. The sergeant finished his ale and accepted the third round Cael ordered. Spent weeks going through historical records, documents from before the Realm Wars, old stuff, some of it supposedly mythical. This was new information, potentially significant. Any idea what kind of historical records? Genealogical research, from what I overheard. Family trees, bloodline documentation, that sort of thing. Strange thing for a military commander to be interested in, if you ask me. The sergeant was getting talkative now, the combination of alcohol and a willing listener overriding his usual operational security. Cael encouraged him with interested nods and the occasional clarifying question. Though I suppose everyone has hobbies, the man continued. Even commanders who can... He stopped himself, shaking his head. Never mind. Probably shouldn't speculate about things I don't understand. Can what? Cael asked casually, but the sergeant had caught himself. Just military stuff. Above both our pay grades, He straightened slightly, military discipline reasserting itself. "But I'll tell you this. Whatever she's looking for, it's important enough that she's pulled research teams from 3 different realms to assist." They continued drinking and talking for another hour, the conversation drifting to safer topics like food quality in different realms and the relative merits of various posting assignments. But the sergeant had revealed enough to give Cael several new avenues of investigation. Ravina was conducting genealogical research using historical archives from multiple realms. She was searching for something specific, something important enough to involve extensive resources. And her behavior had changed recently, becoming more focused and intense. Most intriguingly, the sergeant had started to say something about what Ravina could do, then stopped himself. Whatever that ability was, it fell into the category of things soldiers weren't supposed to discuss with civilians. As the evening wound down and the sergeant prepared to return to his barracks, Cael made one final attempt at useful intelligence. "You know, if you ever need someone to talk to about the stress of cross-realm deployments, I'm usually here most evenings. Gets lonely being back in civilian life after military service." The sergeant nodded, clearly appreciating the offer. "Same here. And if you ever want to hear more stories about the interesting places the military sends you, I'm happy to share. Some of them are even true." They shook hands, and the sergeant departed with the slightly unsteady gait of someone who'd had just enough to drink to sleep soundly. Cael remained at the bar for another 30 minutes, processing what he'd learned while maintaining his cover as a civilian veteran unwinding after a difficult day. Genealogical research, historical archives from multiple realms, something that made even experienced soldiers nervous to discuss. A search that had intensified recently and involved significant resources. The information raised as many questions as it answered, but it provided clear direction for further investigation. If Ravina was researching bloodlines and family histories, then her real purpose in Concordia might have nothing to do with military occupation or research oversight. It might be personal. As Cael finally left the tavern and made his way through Concordia's nighttime streets, he reflected on how the evening's intelligence gathering had gone. The sergeant had been genuinely helpful, his information appearing authentic rather than planted. But Cael couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, evaluated, his methods observed by eyes that saw more than human vision should allow. Somewhere in the city, Ravina was monitoring his progress, perhaps already knowing what he'd discovered and how he'd discovered it. The question was whether the information he'd gathered was genuine intelligence or part of an elaborate misdirection designed to lead him away from her real objectives. 2 weeks to uncover the truth. 1 evening's work complete, with 13 days remaining. The game was well and truly underway, and Commander Cael Varnor was beginning to understand just how complex the rules really were. But he was also beginning to glimpse the shape of something larger, a purpose that went beyond military strategy or research oversight, something that might explain why a supernatural being with vast power would spend months playing administrative games in an occupied city. The White Lily had been the right choice. Now he had to prove worthy of the challenge it had accepted.